Hey, I'm Gabe. I'm an animator and motion designer. I always like watching these project breakdowns, so I figured I'd make one for this project. I'm going to add chapter markers to the video, so feel free to skip ahead. Alright, let's jump in. Okay, so now we're in After Effects and you can see things look a little different. I'll go over everything to show you where I had to make changes to make this work in After Effects. Okay, so the setup's pretty similar to Illustrator, but some of the highlights didn't come over correctly, so I just rebuilt them. So for example, if we look at this hood, you can see I have this main shape layer and I added an inner glow to that. And then on top of that, I added these highlights and added a fast box blur, which if I turn it off, you can see what those shapes look like without it. And here it is back on. So I did the same thing for the rest of the highlights. Then I added this lighting, which is just a solid with this gradient ramp applied to it. Then I dropped the opacity of the layer to 80%, changed the blending mode to soft light, and set this hood layer as the track matte. Then I added a mask to shape the lighting. And I did that for the body and the sleeves as well. I ended up having to completely rebuild these sleeves in After Effects to get the wave effect. To do this, I started with this white solid and added this layer mask to it. Then I added this adjustment layer with this wave warp effect, which ends up looking like this. From there, I took that composition and added it to this one, added this fill effect to get the base color, then added this inner glow layer style. I also added these shape layers with the fast box blur to get these highlights. To get these highlights to animate along with the sleeve cuff, I made an export of the sleeve, brought it into Photoshop, and made roughs of the highlight frame by frame. From there, I exported a PNG sequence and brought it into After Effects. Then I traced that using shape layers, and then I brought it into this comp and added the fill to get the color, and then added the fast box blur again. And that just sits on top of the shape layer with the inner glow layer style and that same lighting effect added to it I described earlier. I used a similar method for both the head and the hands where I kind of sandwiched them in between two layers. So to show you what I'm talking about, if I turn the sleeve front off, you can see there's this hand and then that background layer, so the hand's kind of sandwiched between it. And I've got a similar thing going on with the hood where I have two copies of the same layer. One's behind the head and one's in front, except for this one in front has a mask on it so it can sit on top of the head. The next thing I'll go over is the mustache and the beard. For the mustache, I started with the white solid again. I drew this mask on top of it to get the mustache shape, then added this adjustment layer with the wave warp effect on it, which ended up looking like this. Then I brought it into this comp, added a gray fill effect, added the inner glow layer style, and then duplicated it and flipped it to create the other side. I did the same thing for the beard, starting with the white solid. I drew this mask, added an adjustment layer with this wave warp effect, which looked like this. Then I took that comp and brought it into this one, added the gray fill effect and the inner glow layer style. I duplicated it, adjusted the position and rotation, and ended up with this. I brought that comp into this one and added this mask so it fit over the face. Next, I'll go over how I animated this hand. The first thing I did was use Rubberhose 3 to make a rubber rig for each of these four main fingers, and then I parented that base to the hand. And then I animated the hand rotating slightly and then returning, and then went back and animated the tips of the fingers to follow that motion. And that gave me the slight waving effect to the hand. I also animated the thumb rotating along with the hand to give it some movement. Now I'm going to use Rubberhose 3 to set up a rubber rig on one of these fingers so you can see how I did it for the animation. The first thing you want to do is take the anchor point tool and align the anchor point over where you want each part of the finger to bend. Now you want to parent each part of this finger together, so I'm going to parent the top to the midsection and then the midsection to the base. Next, you want to select all the layers, click New Rubber Rig, give it a name, and select Base Tip as the type. Once the rig was created, I parented the base to the hand so that when the hand moved, the base would move along with it. Once I set up rigs for the other three fingers, I was able to just keyframe the tip for each of them to follow the hand. And this is the hand animation I ended up with. I also parented the hands to the sleeves and added some animation to them, so they wave slightly and then they shoot back and slam together. For the face animation, I used the Joysticks and Sliders plugin, which allowed me just to animate the position of this controller to go between the resting up and down positions which is a lot easier than trying to get the timing right using individual layers. I'm going to go over how I made the head rig for this character using joysticks. So the first thing I want to do is bring up the position keyframes for everything I want to control. Then on frame 0, I'm going to keyframe all of them. This is going to be the origin pose. Next I go to frame 1 to set up the next pose, which will be the right pose. And I'll just hit shift a couple times for this example. Now I'll go to frame 2 to set up the next pose, which will be the left. And you can actually hit Alt and then click origin. And that'll paste the origin pose back on. Then I can just hit shift a couple times again, except for to the left this time. Now I'll go to frame 3 and set up the next pose, which will be the up pose. And I can press Alt again and then click origin to paste the origin pose again. Then I'll set up the up pose. Now I'll go to the next frame, which is frame 4, to set up the last pose, which is the down position. Press Alt, click origin to set up the origin pose again. Then set up the down pose. Now that I've got all those positions set up, I can click this create new joysticks button. Give it a name. Click OK. And now you can use this controller to easily move through all the positions you just set up. Here's what the face animation ended up looking like. I also animated the hood dropping by animating the Y position, copying the easing from the head rig, and offsetting a couple frames. From there, I brought the character into this composition where I added all the other elements. The first thing I'll go over is this background. It's supposed to be like time going by on a clock. It kind of looks like a ruler, but I tried it several other ways and it didn't quite turn out. The first thing I did was make these clock numbers in Illustrator. Then I brought them over into After Effects and made this loop. I added this shape layer, which has a gray fill, and added a gradient overlay similar to the inner glow I've been using. I brought that comp into this one and duplicated the layer using this expression so that when it was duplicated, it would adjust the position as well. From there, I brought that comp into this one and added this expression to the rotation property so that it would rotate. I also added plus value so I could add keyframes on top of it, but I didn't end up using it. I added some effects to get the look I was going for. Polar coordinates, twirl, optics compensation, CC lens, turbulent displace, and then I added this expression to evolution to give it some variation. Then I brought that comp into this main comp with the other elements. Then I added a noise effect, colorama, this RGB separation, which is a red giant effect. It's pretty subtle, but it adds a pretty cool effect. Another red giant effect, which is this uniglow. And I had this posterized time on there, but it ended up messing up this animation, so I turned it off. Next, I made this glowing star. I made the star by making all these shape layers, parenting them to this null, keyframing one full rotation, looping it with this loop out expression, and then adding this wiggle expression to the position. Then I added this adjustment layer, added this red giant universe glow, and red giant trap code star glow as well. And after all that, I ended up with this. Behind the looping time animation, I added this solid layer, where I added this gradient ramp and this CC toner effect. Then I added this 50% gray solid, changed the blending mode to overlay, added a noise, Gaussian blur, and a posterized time to slow down the animation of the noise. The hourglass was made in Cinema 4D, and then I exported the PNG sequence and brought it into After Effects. Here's the hourglass in Cinema 4D, and I've got the interactive render region on so you can see what it looks like fully rendered. So this scene has a pretty simple setup. The first thing is this camera, which I changed the focal length to 50 on. Then I set up the composition. The next thing is this sky object that just has this material on it with this gray color and the luminance channel only. Next, I set up this infinite light, changed the shadow to ray trace hard, and then changed the shadow color to the stark gray color. Next, I went into the cell settings, adjusted these colors, made sure I had these settings checked. Then I enabled the bump channel, went into it, added a noise to the texture. Then I went into the noise, adjusted the scale, and then adjusted the bump strength. Adjusting the noise scale and the bump strength changes the way this grain looks, so you can see if I turn this bump strength up, then go into the noise and increase the scale, it gives you a totally different look. So you can just adjust these two settings and get the look you're going for. I did the same thing in the glass material, except for in the cell settings, I only used 2 colors, unchecked shadows, and in the bump channel, I increased the scale slightly. To build the glass, I started with this spline, added that to this lathe object to give it its main shape, then added this cloth surface to smooth it out a little bit. For the top and the bottom, I just took a cylinder, inset it and extruded it a few times, and then added a bevel to some of the edges. Then I made this cylinder, added it to this cloner, set the mode to radial, and adjusted these settings. Here's everything all together without the materials added. Here's what that looks like without any of the effects added. I brought it into this main comp and added these effects as well. Tritone, Red Giant Universe RGB separation, Red Giant Universe glow, and this Red Giant Trap Code Star glow as well. In this comp, I added this scale animation to the star so it would have a subtle pulsing effect, and then in the last few frames when the hands slapped together it would look like it exploded. Now I'll go over these adjustment layers one by one and show you the effects I added. The first one I added was this Red Giant Universe RGB separation. Then I added this gray solid, changed the blending mode to overlay, turned down the opacity to 65%, added this tin effect, noise, and posterized time. Then I added this adjustment layer with the curves effect and a Gaussian blur. Then I masked it out and inverted it to give it a vignette. I added a posterized time so that it would animate every 2 frames instead of every frame. To get this transition at the end, I brought the main comp into this one. I duplicated the star transition, changed the fill to black, then I used it as a track matte for this main comp layer so I could animate its scale and get a transition to a new shot using a similar animation as the explosion. Alright, that's it. I tried to cover everything, but if I missed anything, let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to you. Alright, catch you later.